Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel. People call me Dinko. I'm the pastor here at Kindred. And before we begin, I definitely want to thank our sister Xenia for leading us in that very real and raw prayer. You know, it's a reminder for us that as different people lead us in prayer from this stage every week, you know, those are their prayers too. As they pray for all of us as a congregation, you know, they come with their own, the things going on in their hearts. And even as tears are shed, it's a wonderful reminder for us, the Lord loves and hears those prayers, and Christ himself weeps with us, with all the concerns and cares of our hearts. And that's true for our sister Xenia as she led us. That's true for all of you as you prayed alongside with us this Sunday and every Sunday. We are continuing in our beginnings series, which means we're reading through Genesis. I know it's December, and so starting next Sunday, we'll be taking a break from Genesis. We'll be talking about Advent and Christmas. But today will be the last Sunday where we talk about Genesis for a few weeks. And we are in Genesis 39 now. We're almost near the end, guys. There's only 50 chapters in Genesis. We're on 39. Can you believe it? And if you were here with us last week, in some ways, this is like a part two. Genesis 38 was about Jacob's son Judah, who has his own sordid events happening. Now in Genesis 39, we see kind of similar themes. So with that being said, I do want to remind everyone, if you weren't here last week, we are talking about some adult situations in this passage, some mature themes. So if there does happen to be young ones in here, I do recommend discretion. And if you're listening in on the live stream with young ones, I recommend discretion. We'll be reading Genesis 39 in its entirety, the whole chapter. Let's turn there. It's also projected for you overhead. Let's give our attention and reverence, for this is the reading of God's word. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, we remember he was sold into slavery by his brothers, right? And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me, except you, because you're his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. But one day when he went into the house to do his work and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. This is God's word. Whoa, sorry about that. This is a well-known story of Joseph refusing the advances of Potiphar's wife. And this is particularly interesting, especially when you recognize this is placed immediately after last week's story, Genesis 38. We see this juxtaposition of Judah's story and Joseph's story, one right after another, Genesis 38, Genesis 39. And that juxtaposition is intentional. We, as an audience, are meant to compare the two stories, to compare these two situations, to even compare these two men. And there are definitely some striking similarities between what happens in both of these situations. Let me share just a few. In both, you can argue the men, the sons of Jacob, Judah and Joseph, they are both in difficult seasons of their life. In Judah's case last week, he had just grieved the loss of his wife. In Joseph's case, very apparently, obviously, he's enslaved. He has no freedom. He's in chains. And all that because his brothers did that to him. They hated him and they sold him into slavery. Both stories, of course, involve sexual situations in the midst of those difficult circumstances, in the midst of those difficult backdrops. We remember Judah, he seeks out a prostitute. Joseph resists the seductions of Potiphar's wife. And both stories involve someone in power trying to exploit someone who is vulnerable, and in both cases, younger, weaker people. In one story, it was a powerful man and his sons exploiting a young woman. In this story, it's a powerful woman, the wife of a powerful man, exploiting a young man or a younger man. And I think one of the most interesting things is both stories involve a woman coming forward with unique possessions that belong to a man, implicating them in sexual impropriety. In one case, it's true, right? Tamar brings forward Judah's unique possessions, his ID, if you will, his credit card, if you will. In this case, today, Potiphar's wife also brings, hey, this is Joseph's garment, isn't it? But of course, she's lying. But I would say the main difference in the midst of all these similarities in the story is that Judah in Genesis 38 lacks integrity. He lacks integrity. He fails morally. Thanks be to God, he repents by the end of the story. And on the other hand, Joseph has the utmost integrity in this story. And so we'll be analyzing today several aspects of Joseph's integrity and what that means for us. Because I do think it's safe to say all of us want integrity in our lives. Whether you phrase it that way or not, all of us want to be consistent with our principles. All of us want to be honest about our principles and about our values and our beliefs. All of us, don't want to be hypocrites and two-faced in how we operate and how we live our lives, whether people are looking or not, in public, in private. And so today we'll look at what does Joseph's integrity, what does it look like? And just as a little, to be clear, a little disclaimer, when we talk about integrity, when we talk about temptation, in this story, yes, it is in a sexual context, sexual integrity, sexual temptation. But I do believe that as we analyze this integrity, it does apply to integrity in general as well. So we're going to use those terms a little interchangeably as we speak of integrity and temptation, be it in sexual situations or other situations. There are many other temptations that are not sexual in nature, and there is integrity in and of itself is not just about sexuality, of course, but we'll be kind of talking about both as we talk about integrity today. So the first thing we see in this passage is integrity starts small. Integrity starts small. Integrity starts in the everyday moments. Integrity starts in the small things of life. Do you think Joseph just suddenly became this man of integrity overnight when Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him? Suddenly all this integrity just filled his heart. He just woke up that morning and he happened to say, I want more integrity today. No, of course not, right? Integrity was his lifestyle, it was part of his life. And you know how we know that? We see a hint of that because we see this process that he went through at the very early part of this passage, of this chapter. It's easy to miss, but the early part of the passage tells us this. It says, Joseph started, of course, as he got enslaved and now he belonged to Potiphar's household, he started outside. He started as someone working in the field, a servant, a slave working in the field, which I'm sure we all know is the worst place to be. But because he does his job well, because he's faithful at his tasks, because he's trustworthy, they move him into the house, and he gets to serve indoors. And then because he does his job well, because he serves with integrity, he serves with faithfulness, they move him into a greater position inside the house, and he ends up being the overseer of basically everything that Potiphar belongs to. And I love this phraseology in the beginning of the story when it talks about how he serves Potiphar, and then even at the end of the story when he's in a different kind of prison now, and he's still doing a good job there. If anyone here has to manage people at all, right? Maybe you work in an office and you supervise somebody, or you have your own business and you have employees. This totally resonates with you, doesn't it? This idea that both Potiphar and the prison guard, they both were able to just say, I don't have to worry about anything. This guy is so trustworthy and reliable. I don't have to think about anything. Potiphar's like, all I think about is what I'm going to eat now every day. I don't have to worry about anything in my house because he takes care of it. The prison guards, he's like, everything in this prison, it's going to be all right because Joseph's taking care of it. Is that not integrity to begin with? Is that not a lifestyle? Starting in the everyday moments. It's not just right when the big temptation, the big test comes that suddenly he has it, but it's been part of his whole life. I remember hearing this commencement speech from a high-ranking Navy SEAL, and it's kind of like this viral video thing, and he advises these graduating students. He gives them this really simple advice, and he says, make your bed every day. Make your bed every day. It's like, okay. It's very small, it's very simple, it's very easy, it's a simple task. But his whole point is, by starting off the day, the first thing you do in the morning is this small little success, this small little act of being diligent and faithful. It sets you up, right? It sets you up for the greater wins, the greater successes, the greater tasks to be accomplished throughout that day, throughout your life. And likewise, integrity starts small. You know who else said something like that? Who cares about some viral video, right? This commencement speech. But you know who else said something like that? Jesus in Luke 16. Luke 16:10, he says this, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. Let that sink in just a little bit. I think I'll be the first to confess that we all have instances in our life where we say like a little white lie. We're not honest, but we think, it's not that bad, right? Usually it's like a lie of convenience. Maybe you lied about your kid's age at the buffet. Oh, yeah, see, you're laughing because you feel a little guilty, or you know somebody who did that. Maybe you just did that yesterday. You lie about, oh yeah, she's 3, but she's really 4. I heard a funny story recently where they did that, and then the kid was like, I'm not 3. It's like, be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. Maybe you've lied to get out of an uncomfortable social situation. I think that's probably one we've all done. Like, there's this uncomfortable thing, and the best way to just Get out of there. The best way to dip out of there is just say a little lie and you're free, right? We've all done something like that. I know we all have. I have too. And, we're not here to judge you, and the Lord's not going to strike you down for those little white lies. But I will say this. There still is an issue here. Because if you think about it, even with the little white lies, the lies of convenience, the lies to save $20, it trains our hearts to be okay with not having integrity. At least in those small things, doesn't it? And it can become a slippery slope. Sometimes when you forego integrity in the small things, you are at least potentially setting yourself up to forego integrity in the big things. Think about how Jesus says, when it comes to the subject of sexual lust, he says, even when you look upon someone with lustful intent, it's like you're committing adultery with them. We remember Jesus said that. And of course, to be clear, on one hand, Jesus is saying that to call out those people who think they're so pure because, I've never committed adultery. And he's getting at their hearts, right? Like your heart is still adulterous. But I do think there's some practical wisdom and warning built into that teaching as well. When he says, even when you just look upon someone with lustful intent, there's something bad going on here. It's like you're committing adultery. You are committing adultery. And if we use like just our kind of common sense, we go, but it's still a little different, isn't it? Like you're not going to treat someone who says, I had a lustful thought. Like, let's say you're married and your husband or your wife comes to you and says, I had a lustful thought. You're not going to treat her or him the same way as if your husband came up to you and confessed full-on adultery, right? But here's the bridge between that gap, is if you are consistently allowing your mind to commit adultery in your mind over and over again, through fantasizing, through pornography, through other illicit actions, are you not setting yourself up to potentially give into that temptation in bigger ways as well? Are you not training the muscle memory of your mind and your heart to give into temptation over and over again? We must remember integrity starts small in the everyday moments. That's the first thing we see in Joseph's integrity. It starts in the everyday, as he just works and does what he's supposed to do, does what he needs to do. But secondly, we see that integrity sets you free. Integrity sets you free. The irony of this story is that Joseph is literally a slave in this story. He is literally in chains. By the end of the story, he's a prisoner, right? But because of his integrity, he's the most free character in this story. You could even think of it as he's more free than Potiphar's wife in so many ways. Look at verse 10 of our text. It says, Potiphar's wife spoke to Joseph day after day, and he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. And just note, it says day after day. And you can imagine, it's just this relentless thing. She cannot let it go that Joseph doesn't want to sleep with her. And whether it's because of her sexual desire or because of this stubborn desire to get what she wants, to get her way, or perhaps a combination of both, she's relentless. And I bet every time that Joseph says no, it just gets to her even more. It bothers her even more. She wants it even more. And it gets so bad that she's straight up willing to ruin Joseph's life further because of this. Like, he's already a slave, but basically she's potentially killing him. You tell the master of the house, this guy tried to sexually assault me, he's going to die. He gets put in prison, and where execution is a strong possibility. And yet, Joseph is more free than her. The former president of America, Dwight D. Eisenhower, is known for having said that freedom is the opportunity for self-discipline. It's kind of a counterintuitive quote, right? Freedom is the opportunity for self-discipline. We think of freedom as I can do whatever I want, whenever I want. I think that's how we often would define freedom, and there's truth to that definition, of course. But when we abuse our freedom, when we don't combine freedom with discipline and integrity, we actually stop being free. I think we all know this. We need limits. We need boundaries. We need restraints, even, for the sake of living as free men and women of God. Even if discipline and those kinds of words, self-discipline, integrity, they sound kind of binding, right? I admit, they sound kind of binding, but they bind you to free you. St. Augustine once said that a fish is most free in what? In water, right? A fish is most free to be all it's meant to be as a fish in the bounds of water. When it's constrained and restrained and limited by water, it's most free. Because you take the limits of water out of the fish, it's dead. It's flopping around and then it stops moving. Romantic love is most free within the bounds, the limitations of marriage vows. That kind of romance and love flourishes most when it's bound by those kinds of marriage promises, marriage vows. And likewise, integrity binds us to free us, especially in the midst of a world full of relentless temptation. You can be sure that temptation, especially sexual temptation, but really all temptation, they come at you with this false promise of freedom, but it's really there to enslave you. It's really there to enslave you. Judah in last week's message, Potiphar's wife in today's message, even though they were doing everything they wanted, they were really slaves. They were slaves to their desires. They were slaves to their egos. They were slaves to the idols of their culture. An evolutionary psychologist from Harvard by the name of Deidre Barrett, she wrote a book about something called supernormal stimuli. Supernormal stimuli. And she argues in her book that supernormal stimuli is the cause of a lot of society's problems today. She didn't coin that term. She's not the first to research it, but she does write about how supernormal stimuli is the exaggerated imitations of real things that appeal to the primitive instincts within us, and they attract us away from the real things. I know that was a difficult definition. Let me say it again. Supernormal stimuli is exaggerated imitations of real things that attract us away from the actual real things. The exaggerated imitations. In various experiments, birds would sit on fake, exaggerated eggs. They were bigger and colored more extravagantly, and the birds would sit on those eggs and try to incubate those eggs, and they would leave their actual real eggs behind, and they would never hatch. There was another experiment where there were butterflies, and they would bring these fake, exaggerated butterflies, and all the male butterflies would fly to the fake butterfly and try to mate with the fake butterfly. And then the real butterflies never mated. An author named Brant Hansen, commenting and referencing the research of Deidre Barrett, writes this: "We humans have the same problem. We'll go for the exaggerated fake, and we lose our appetite for the real. The deepest tragedy is that giving in to our desire for the fake distorts us psychologically, sexually, even physically. We become less real, less human, and if I could add, less free. Less free." We live in a world full of supernormal stimuli. I'm not even talking about just sexual supernormal stimuli, but just we live in this age where there's just so many things just bombarding our senses, information overload, information addiction, but yes, even sexually. We live in an age where pornography is more accessible than ever before. ever before, right? Think about that. Think about how easy it is to access. We need to be mindful of how easy it is to be warped, to be enslaved, how easy it is to turn into people who don't want real things anymore. Why should we resist pornography? Why should we resist all sorts of lewd images and scandalous and scintillating images? Why should we even avoid fantasizing about people who are not our spouse? Why should we avoid, let's even get into kind of more the real life stuff, the quote unquote real life stuff. Why should we avoid one night stands? Why should we avoid prostitution? Why should you avoid that illicit place that you might be tempted to go to? Because if you do that stuff, it makes you dirty. Because if you do that stuff, it makes you a pervert. Because if you do that stuff, you're tainted and you're impure, and you should be ashamed of yourself if you do that stuff. Is that the main reason? To be honest, I don't think those are the best reasons to resist those sorts of things. How about because those things are not real? They're not real. Pornography is the epitome of that which is not real. Illicit interactions with people who are doing sexual acts for money. That's not real. Yeah, they might be real people, but they're not acting like real people. That's not what real people are like. That's not what real relationships are like. That's not what real bodies are like for the most part. That's not what real love is like. You ever fantasize about someone who's not your spouse, and in that fantasy, they disagree with you? You ever fantasize about someone who's not your spouse, and in that fantasy they correct you? Or they're tired? Or they're irritable? They don't do everything you want in your fantasy? Do you have fantasies like that? Of course not. Well, I don't know. I can't assume that about every single person, but probably not. You know why? Because your fantasies are not about real people. They're not about real relationships. They're not about real love. Those images, those pornographic images, are not real people ultimately. It's dots on a screen. It's binary code made to produce this image of what you think you would want in the opposite sex. But it's really just there to enslave you. It's really just there to make you someone who goes after and is attracted to and takes in all that is not real. And as Deidre Barrett and even Brant Hansen says, and it makes us less real. It makes us enslaved, less free. Brothers and sisters, please choose integrity, not because of fear, not because of guilt, not because of shame, but because you want to be free. Because you want to be a real person, the way God created us to be. Integrity starts small. Integrity sets us free. And lastly, integrity grows in gratitude with God. What does Joseph say when he resists the seduction of Potiphar's wife? He says this in verse 9. Potiphar is not greater in this house than I am. In other words, Potiphar basically made me his right-hand man. I'm basically equal with him when it comes to everything I have oversight over and control over, power over. He hasn't kept anything back from me except you. How can I do this great wickedness? And I love how he says, and sin against Potiphar? No, and sin against God. Integrity happens when God is in the picture. Oh, it's not even just about Potiphar. Oh, I don't want to do Potiphar dirty. That's good. But God is still in the picture. Ultimately, this would be a sin against God. Ultimately, his gratitude for all that he has, despite his terrible situation of being a slave, he gives credit to God. We know this because everyone who reads this passage knows this. Even Potiphar knows this. Have you noticed this? Maybe you were being a good Bereans, and you were like, as I was saying the early point, you're like, wait a minute. It said that Joseph was successful, but it said something else important, didn't it? It didn't just say he had integrity and he was faithful and he was diligent and he was disciplined. It says something else. Notice how many times in the early part in verse 2 and 3, as well as later when he's in prison, verses 21 and 23, note how many times it says, the Lord was with Joseph, and therefore he became successful. The master Potiphar saw that the Lord was with him. The Lord is the one who brought the success. The Lord was with Joseph, showed him his steadfast love. The keeper of the prison saw that Joseph, he could do everything and he could be in charge of everything because the Lord was with him. And this is the grace of God. It's an important question. Did Joseph receive the grace of God because he had integrity? Or did Joseph have integrity because he received the grace of God? I know it's a little confusing, but we're talking about what's the cause here? What came first, the grace of God or Joseph's integrity? And I'm certain that it's the grace of God. Because Joseph received the grace of God, because he cherished and experienced and heard and remembered, and I'm sure he prayed as well, that God was with him again and again, that's what led him to have integrity. Brothers and sisters, please don't walk out of here simply saying, I just need to be more like Joseph. I just need to be more like Joseph. I just need to have more integrity. I just need to do better. And then just walk out. Because we're talking about the deep things of the heart here. We know it's not so easy. You don't just turn a switch and now you have integrity. But rather walk out of here saying, I want to grow in my gratitude for the grace of God. I want to grow in my gratitude over the fact that God is with me. So clearly demonstrated in Jesus, whom we celebrate this Christmas as Emmanuel. What does Emmanuel mean? God with us. And as I cherish the fact that God is with me more and more, as I grow in my gratitude for the grace of God that I don't deserve, your integrity will follow. Your integrity will follow. And no other motivation will do, right? The beauty of gratitude compelling you to have integrity is that that's when it's truly integrity. It's real, it's sincere, it's genuine. If you do all the right things on the outside, but the motivation is guilt and shame and feeling forced and feeling afraid, then that's not really integrity, right? That's really guilt. That's all it is. Guilt, shame, force, fear. But gratitude produces real integrity. Gratitude produces real integrity. Joseph had much integrity because he walked with God. He cherished and was grateful for the fact that God was with him. And he did not fail when it came to the temptation of Potiphar's wife. Now, I know that everyone in this room, I'll be the first to confess, does not always feel like you are just like Joseph. I know that. Of course I know that, because I know human beings, and you know human beings. I know no one here is like, oh yeah, I'm just like Joseph. I have integrity in spades. I always do the right thing. And let me offer you some hope if you don't feel quite like Joseph today, or perhaps every day. You know, Jesus had a very important conversation in John chapter 4 with a woman who wasn't exactly the pinnacle of integrity, especially when it came to marriage and her love life. And in John 4:13-14, as Jesus is talking to this woman who has a little bit of a past, right? And she's even not, it's not just her past, it's actually her present too. Jesus points that out. They're sitting by this well, and this is what he says. Everyone who drinks of this water from the well, you could argue from this world, will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Let that encourage you, because you know how this story goes? Even though Jesus knows everything about this woman's life and her lack of integrity, he offers her that living water. She actually comes to acknowledge that he is the Christ, the Messiah. She even becomes like an evangelist. She's like telling people about, see this man that I just met. I think he's the Christ. He told me everything about me. He told me all about the dark things that I don't like to talk about, all the shameful things, the quote unquote dirty things that I don't like to talk about. He talked all about that, and yet he still said, I can give you this living water and you will never be thirsty again. Because I am the Christ. Brothers and sisters, Jesus offers you that living water. Whatever your integrity status may be. And when we want that living water that comes from faith in Jesus more than we want the fake things and the false promises of this world, then we will truly be free. You know, when we first had our daughter Emery, not too long ago, of course, I remember a parent giving us this advice about dealing with infants. You know, there's a lot of times when you have to take something away from a little infant, right? Like maybe because it's dangerous or it's not theirs. And when you take something away, when you say, no, no, you can't hold that sharp pencil, right? When you say no and you take something away, what happens? They lose it. They cry their head off, right? And the parent's advice was, you got to quickly give them something else, right? Don't touch those scissors. Here's a toy train, right? And you give them something else. You got to replace it. And of course, although you and I are a little more sophisticated than little infants, we too need a better replacement. You know, I really do believe it's not enough to just say no, right? Some of us grew up with that campaign, just say no. It was about drugs mainly. Just say no. But the goal is not just say no to temptation. Just say no to pornography. Just say no to all the things of this world, the supernormal stimuli that try to enslave you. Just say no and be just empty. Have nothing. Just say no to everything, push everything away. No, we need something greater, a greater love, a realer love. It's not just say no to Potiphar's wife. It's say no to Potiphar's wife, say no to temptation, but say yes to something else. We need that something else. And praise be to God that he offers us that something else. A Scottish pastor by the name of Thomas Chalmers gave this well-known sermon called The Expulsive Power of a New Affection. And when I first heard about this sermon in seminary, because I don't know how to read, I thought it said the explosive power of a new affection. I was like, oh, explosive power. I like that. Explosive. But I was like, oh, no. Expulsive. It expels, right? This new affection that we have in Jesus, this real affection, it expels the false and the fake. And he writes this, the love of the world cannot be expunged or expelled by a mere demonstration of the world's worthlessness. It's not enough to just say, look how worthless this all is. But may it not be supplanted by the love of that which is more worthy than itself? You need to replace, you need to supplant with something greater. And the reality of the love of God is this, that the one who had the most integrity, more than Joseph ever could have, Jesus himself, he too would be falsely accused by spiteful people. And he too would receive a punishment that he did not deserve. And you know, in Joseph's case, we'll see this as we keep studying Genesis, Joseph would end up, because of all this stuff that happens, even the lies about him from Potiphar's wife, he ends up being placed in a position where he could save a lot of lives. We'll see that later in Genesis. And for Jesus too, as he would be sentenced to death on a cross, that too would be powerfully, wonderfully, beautifully used by our God to save many lives, to save our lives, to grant us the forgiveness of sin, to grant us adoption into the household of God. We don't just get to be slaves in God's house, servants in God's house. We get to be called sons and daughters in God's house. And it gives us a new and greater affection. God demonstrates his love for us in this. While we were sinners, while we were still lacking integrity, while we were still choosing the fake over the real, while we were still choosing slavery over freedom, while we were still choosing the world over God, Christ would die for us. Christ would die for us. And that love would be an expulsive love, a real love, even an explosive love that grants us an expulsive gratitude, that we may truly have freedom and integrity. Let's pray. As we come before our God, can you lay down at his feet whatever comes to mind as you hear this message? I admit, not the most bright and sunny message, but as you think about supernormal stimuli, all the fake and false promises of this world, would you lay down that which seeks to enslave you? Lay it at God's feet. Take the living water that Christ provides freely through his death on that cross, through his resurrection, through the new life that he provides. Would you pray at this time to your Heavenly Father, and our worship team will lead us in a song.